Emily adjusted the straps of her backpack, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The trail ahead twisted and disappeared into the dense forest, a rich tapestry of greens and browns. She felt at home here, surrounded by the towering trees and the symphony of rustling leaves. The world of deadlines and constant notifications was a distant memory in this serene pocket of wilderness. She tugged her water bottle from its holder, took a long sip, and started walking. Her boots crunched against the gravel path, the sound blending with the chirps of birds hidden in the canopy above. She paused to glance at a weathered wooden sign marking the trailhead. Bear warning, recent sightings, exercise caution. Emily frowned slightly, the weight of the words settling over her. She had read similar warnings on other hikes, but she'd never actually encountered a bear. She knew the drill: make noise, stay calm, keep your distance. Still, she felt a pang of unease. Shaking it off, she muttered to herself, "Relax, Emily. You've got this." As she ventured deeper into the forest, the trail narrowed and the shadows grew longer. Her footsteps slowed when she reached a small clearing. Here the sunlight streamed through the gaps in the trees, illuminating a patch of wildflowers. She crouched down, brushing her fingers lightly against the petals, marveling at their vibrant colors. "Beautiful," she whispered, smiling to herself. She stood, adjusted her backpack, and continued walking. The terrain became more challenging, with roots snaking across the path like nature's booby traps. She climbed over a fallen log, her hand brushing the rough bark, and paused again to catch her breath. That's when she heard it, a soft rustling. In the distance, her body tensed, her ears straining to catch the sound again. The forest was never silent, but this noise was different, heavier. She stayed still, the pounding of her heart filling the quiet. After a moment, the sound ceased, leaving her wondering if it had been a deer or perhaps just the wind stirring the underbrush. Shaking her head, she muttered, "Stop freaking yourself out, Emily." Still, her steps became more cautious, her senses heightened. She focused on the path ahead, noting every crackling leaf and snapping twig. Her hiking poles tapped against the ground rhythmically, offering a small sense of reassurance. Around midday, she stopped at a rocky outcrop that overlooked a gentle slope. Sitting down, she unpacked her lunch, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, some trail mix, and an apple. As she ate, her eyes scanned the forest, the vast expanse of trees stretching as far as she could see. It was moments like this that made every ache and blister worth it. The world felt endless, alive. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint noise behind her, the same rustling she'd heard earlier. She turned sharply, her pulse quickening, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just trees, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. Still, a sliver of unease wormed its way back into her chest. She decided to press on, feeling the weight of the wilderness settle around her. The afternoon light grew softer, casting long shadows across the trail. Emily hummed quietly to herself, a habit she'd developed on solo hikes to keep herself company and, admittedly, to deter wildlife. The melody was broken, however, when she spotted fresh claw marks on a tree trunk. Stopping in her tracks, she leaned in to get a closer look. The gouges were deep, jagged, and unmistakably recent. Her heart thudded in her chest. "Okay," she said aloud, her voice steady but tinged with nerves. "That's fine. Just passing through your territory, buddy." Her grip on the hiking poles tightened as she continued. Every sound seemed amplified. The crunch of her boots, the creak of swaying trees, the distant caw of a crow. She started talking to herself again, partly to fill the silence, partly to calm her nerves. "You're fine, Emily. You've read all the guides. Bears don't want to mess with you. Just keep walking, keep your distance, and everything will be okay." The trail began to ascend sharply, and she focused on the burn in her legs, using it to distract herself from the growing tension. She reached a small ridge and paused to catch her breath, looking out at the sprawling valley below. It was stunning, the way the sunlight danced across the treetops, painting them in shades of gold and emerald. She pulled out her phone to snap a picture, even though she knew she wouldn't get a signal out here. As she framed the shot, her eyes caught movement in the distance. She lowered the phone and squinted, but whatever it was had vanished. "Probably just a deer," she said quietly, though the unease in her stomach told a different story. The sun dipped lower in the sky as she made her way down the ridge. The forest seemed darker now, the canopy above filtering out much of the remaining light. Emily quickened her pace, eager to find a good spot to set up camp before dusk. Her thoughts were interrupted once again by a sound, a low, deep growl that sent a jolt of fear through her. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. Slowly she turned her head toward the source, her eyes scanning the dense thicket to her left. Nothing. The growl came again, this time closer, more guttural. Her stomach lurched as she saw the faintest hint of movement, a dark mass shifting among the shadows. Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. "Oh God!" Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she knew better. She slowly backed away, her eyes never leaving the spot where she'd seen the movement. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her hands trembled as she fumbled to unclip the bear spray from her belt. "Stay calm," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Just stay calm." The rustling grew louder, the shadows shifting as something, large and powerful, moved toward the edge of the trail. Emily's fingers tightened around the canister, ready to act if the bear came any closer. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the forest falling silent except for the pounding of her heartbeat. The rustling sound returned, louder now, coming from the dense underbrush just ahead. Emily's breath caught in her throat, as her fingers instinctively tightened on the bear spray. Her heart raced, each beat echoing in her ears as she scanned the tree line, searching for movement. "Please, just be a deer," she murmured under her breath, her voice trembling. The sound of snapping twigs sent a fresh wave of panic through her. Her legs felt rooted to the ground as her eyes darted to a spot where the dense foliage seemed to shift unnaturally. Then, just beyond a cluster of ferns, she saw it, a massive, hulking shape. The light filtering through the trees barely illuminated the brown fur of the grizzly bear as it moved slowly through the brush. Emily froze, her chest felt tight and her breath came in shallow gasps. She had read about these moments, even seen videos of bear encounters, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer presence of the animal. Its size was staggering, and its every movement radiated raw power. The bear stopped and raised its head, sniffing the air. Its black eyes gleamed as they swept the trail, and Emily realized with horror that it had locked onto her. "Oh no," she whispered, the words barely audible over the pounding in her ears. She forced herself to take a slow, steady breath. Her mind racing through the advice she'd read about bear encounters. "Don't run, don't turn your back. Speak softly, but don't scream." "Hey there," she said, her voice shaking but soft. "I'm just passing through, okay? Not here to bother you." The bear took a step closer, its massive paws crunching the underbrush. Emily resisted the urge to back away too quickly, knowing sudden movements could provoke an attack. She kept her eyes on the animal, trying to appear calm even as every nerve in her body screamed for her to flee. "I'm going to move now, nice and slow," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "You stay there, and I'll stay over here. Deal?" The bear let out a low, rumbling huff, and Emily felt the ground beneath her tremble slightly. It wasn't a full charge, but the sound was enough to make her legs quiver. She took a small step backward, her hiking boots crunching softly against the gravel trail. As she moved, her foot caught on a root, and she stumbled slightly, her balance wavering for a split second. The bear's ears twitched, and it took another step toward her, its massive frame emerging fully from the underbrush. Emily's stomach churned as she saw the scars and matted fur on its shoulders, signs of a creature that had survived countless battles in the wild. "Easy," she whispered, holding up a hand. "Easy now." The bear growled, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Emily's grip on the bear spray tightened, her thumb hovering over the trigger. She knew it was her last line of defense, but she also knew she had to time it perfectly. Spraying too soon might only agitate the animal further. She took another cautious step back, her movements deliberate and slow. Her pulse raced as she tried to gauge the bear's intentions. Was it curious, defensive, hungry? The possibilities swirled in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. A sudden snap of a branch nearby made the bear's head whip to the side. Emily flinched, her body tensing as she prepared for the worst. The bear shifted its weight, its powerful muscles rippling under its thick coat. For a moment, It seemed distracted, its ears swiveling toward the new sound. Taking advantage of the brief distraction, Emily slowly began to move further down the trail, keeping her eyes on the bear and her bear spray at the ready. Her hands trembled, and she struggled to maintain her composure. "Just keep walking," she muttered to herself. "Nice and easy." The bear turned its gaze back to her, and Emily's breath hitched. It took another step forward, the distance between them shrinking. She could see the muscles in its shoulders, bunching, its body poised as if deciding whether to pursue her or let her go. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple as she continued her slow retreat. Her mind raced through every bit of advice she'd ever heard. Make yourself look big, don't turn your back, don't make sudden movements. But none of it seemed sufficient in the face of the grizzly's sheer size and strength. The bear huffed, again its breath visible in the cool mountain air. It paused, its massive head lowering slightly as it continued to watch her. Emily's stomach clenched as she noticed its claws, sharp and dark, capable of tearing through flesh and bone with ease. She kept moving, her steps steady and deliberate. The trail curved slightly, and she hoped the bear would lose interest once she was out of sight. But the animal didn't move, its dark eyes tracking her every step. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emily reached a slight bend in the trail, putting a few trees between herself and the bear. She risked a quick glance back and saw that the grizzly had stopped, standing motionless at the edge of the clearing. Relief surged through her, but she didn't let herself relax. Not yet. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Please stay there. Please don't follow me." She quickened her pace slightly, her legs shaking with adrenaline. The sounds of the forest seemed to close in around her, every rustle and creak sending a fresh wave of panic through her chest. She forced herself to keep moving, her breathing ragged but controlled. Minutes passed and the trail ahead began to widen, the dense forest giving way to more open terrain. Emily finally allowed herself to glance over her shoulder. The bear was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the trees. Her hands shook as she stuffed the bear spray back into its holster. She felt the weight of what had just happened settling over her like a heavy blanket. She had come face to face with one of nature's most fearsome predators and lived to tell the tale. But the encounter wasn't over in her mind. The image of the grizzly's dark eyes, its massive frame, and the sound of its growl lingered, etched into her memory. She knew the forest was its home, its territory, and she had been lucky this time. As she pressed on, her mind replayed the encounter over and over, each detail sharper and more vivid than before. She tightened her grip on her hiking poles, her resolve firm. She needed to reach safety, to find someone who could help her process what had just happened. "Not out of the woods yet," she muttered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail as Emily trudged forward, her muscles aching with each step. The adrenaline from her encounter with the grizzly was beginning to wear off, replaced by a gnawing fatigue and a sharp pain in her shoulder, where her backpack strap dug into her skin. Every sound seemed amplified, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She stopped at a small stream to refill her water bottle, kneeling by the edge and letting the cool water run over her hands. The rush of the stream was soothing, but her mind couldn't quiet. The image of the bear's dark eyes flashed in her memory and her stomach churned. "I need to keep moving," she muttered, her voice breaking the stillness around her. As she stood, she caught movement out of the corner of her eye. Her body tensed as she turned toward the thicket. For a moment, there was nothing but the sway of the branches in the breeze. Then, through the dense foliage, she saw it, the unmistakable shape of the grizzly bear. It was closer this time, its massive frame partially hidden by the underbrush. The bear's head lowered as it sniffed the air, and Emily felt her blood run cold. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she couldn't move. Why is it still following me? Her mind raced through her options. But the bear was already stepping onto the trail, its claws clicking against the rocks. It wasn't charging, but its presence felt like a looming threat. She had read that bears sometimes follow out of curiosity, but this felt different, more deliberate. Emily tightened her grip on the bear spray, her heart pounding as she slowly backed away. "Hey," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "You don't want to do this. Just stay where you are." The bear's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, but it didn't stop moving. Its dark eyes locked onto her, and Emily could feel the weight of its gaze, heavy and unyielding. She knew she couldn't outrun it, and any sudden movement might provoke an attack. "I'm not a threat," she continued, her voice softer now. "Just passing through, okay?" The bear paused for a moment, its head tilting slightly as if considering her words. Emily's legs ached from the tension of holding her ground, but she didn't dare move. She could feel the cold sweat trickling down her back as she tried to think of a way out. Suddenly, the bear let out a low growl, a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath her feet. Emily's heart leapt into her throat, and she instinctively raised the bear spray, her thumb hovering over the trigger. She knew she had to stay calm, but the sheer size and power of the animal made it nearly impossible. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just go." The bear took another step forward, its massive paw crunching against the gravel. Emily's mind screamed for her to act, to do something, but she was frozen, trapped between fear and instinct. Then, as if sensing her hesitation, the bear lunged forward with a sudden burst of movement. Emily's body reacted before her mind could catch up. She pressed down on the bear spray, releasing a thick cloud of orange mist. The bear reared back, shaking its head and letting out a deafening roar. The sound echoed through the forest, sending a flock of birds into the sky. Emily stumbled backward, her hands shaking as she clutched the now empty canister. The bear pawed at its face, its growls filling the air with raw fury. For a moment it seemed unsure of what to do, its massive body swaying as it tried to shake off the stinging mist. Taking advantage of its confusion, Emily turned and bolted down the trail, her legs pumping with every ounce of strength she could muster. The forest blurred around her, the trees and rocks blending into a chaotic whirl. She could hear the bear's heavy footfalls behind her, and her chest burned as she pushed herself to keep going. "Don't stop," she gasped, her voice barely audible over her ragged breaths. "Just keep running." The trail twisted and turned, and Emily's boots slipped on the loose gravel as she rounded a sharp bend. Her lungs felt like they were on fire, and her vision blurred with tears and sweat. She didn't dare look back, afraid of what she might see. Finally, she spotted a large boulder up ahead, its surface slick with moss. Without thinking, she scrambled behind it, pressing her back against the cold stone and trying to catch her breath. Her entire body trembled as she strained to hear any sign of the bear. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the pounding of her heart in her ears. She clutched the empty bear spray canister like a lifeline, her fingers aching. From the grip, minutes passed, each one stretching into what felt like an eternity, but the bear never appeared. Emily's chest heaved as she let out a shaky breath, her mind racing to process what had just happened. She had come face to face with a grizzly twice now, and somehow she was still alive. But the reality of the situation was sinking in. She was deep in the wilderness, alone and far from help. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling as she tried to check for a signal. Nothing. The screen mocked her with its no service message, and she felt a wave of frustration and fear wash over her. "Damn it," she muttered, shoving the phone back into her pocket. Her eyes darted around the forest, searching for any sign of the bear. She knew it could still be nearby, watching, waiting. The thought made her stomach churn, and she forced herself to focus on the trail ahead. "I have to keep moving," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Gathering her strength, she stood and adjusted her backpack, wincing as the strap pressed against her sore shoulder. She felt vulnerable and exposed, but there was no other choice. She had to put as much distance between herself and the bear as possible before nightfall. With each step, her legs ached, and her mind replayed the encounter over and over. She couldn't shake the image of the bear's dark eyes, its powerful frame, and the sound of its growl. The forest around her felt different now, less like a peaceful retreat and more like a predator's domain. As the shadows lengthened and the air grew cooler, Emily pressed on, her determination fueled by a mix of fear and survival instinct. She knew she had to reach safety, but the question lingered in her mind. How far would the bear follow? The darkness of the forest seemed to close in around Emily as she moved quickly down the trail. Her legs ached from the exertion, and her Breath came in ragged bursts as she tried to keep her pace steady. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through her. The bear was still out there, lurking in the shadows, and Emily knew she had no way of knowing how long it would follow her. She had to keep moving, keep putting miles between herself and the creature that had already come so close. Her heart was racing, and her pulse was a constant thrum in her ears. She stumbled on a root, nearly losing her balance, but quickly caught herself. The trail twisted and turned, the trees narrowing around her, the sense of being trapped creeping in. She pushed the thought aside. She had to stay focused. The bear. Spray was tucked back into the holster at her side, but Emily didn't feel any safer for it. She knew that once it was empty, she was defenseless. All she had now was her speed, her wits, and whatever was left of her strength. The light had begun to fade, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting long shadows across the path. Emily cursed under her breath. She had been hoping to make it to the ranger station before nightfall, but now that seemed impossible. The thought of camping out in the woods overnight, injured and alone, was a terrifying one. A noise behind her made her freeze mid-step. She whipped her head around, her breath catching in her throat. There, just at the edge of her vision, the grizzly was there again, stepping from the trees into the fading light. Her body went cold, and her heart slammed in her chest. The bear was too close. It hadn't just been following her. It was getting bolder, coming closer, maybe even tracking her. It was all she could do to stop herself from panicking. She had to think. The bear wasn't charging, but its presence felt like a threat, as though it was assessing her, trying to decide what to do. She had a moment, just a moment, to make a decision. Her fingers tightened around the bear spray again, but she didn't raise it. She couldn't risk provoking the bear further. "Hey!" she called out, her voice more desperate than she intended. "Go away!" The bear didn't respond. It simply stood there, its massive form looming in the dimming light. Its dark eyes glimmered in the shadows, focused entirely on her. Emily's hands shook as she forced herself to take a step back. She couldn't run. Running would only make it worse. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Please don't come any closer." The bear's nostrils flared, and it took a cautious step forward. Emily felt her stomach drop. It was close enough now that she could see the details of its fur, dark matted patches where the animal had clearly been in fights before, the scars on its shoulders, the rawness of its claws. She felt trapped, her back against the narrow trail, unable to move without getting closer to the bear. "Just leave me alone," she pleaded, her voice barely more than a breath. "I don't want to hurt you." The grizzly paused again, as if considering her words. Emily took another step, back, praying that the bear would lose interest, but it only took another step forward, its massive body swaying slightly. "I can't do this again," she thought, panic rising in her chest. "I can't face this thing again, not like this." Her breath came faster as she instinctively moved toward a nearby tree, hoping the thick trunk would offer some protection. But the moment she turned, the bear let out a low growl, a warning. "Stay back!" Emily cried out, her voice much louder now. She instinctively raised the bear spray, but the bear didn't hesitate. In a flash of motion, it lunged toward her. Her sikas. The world seemed to move in slow motion as the bear's claws swiped at her, cutting across her shoulder with a force that felt like it could tear her in half. She screamed as the sharp pain shot through her, a searing white-hot burn that made her knees buckle. She stumbled back, tripping over a rock behind her, but managed to catch herself on the tree trunk. Her mind raced, her heart hammering in her chest. The pain in her shoulder was unbearable, but she knew she couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to give up. She fumbled for the bear spray again, but the canister slipped from her hand, hitting the ground with a dull thud. The bear advanced again, its enormous body pushing toward her, its eyes focused solely on her. It wasn't just curious anymore, it was hunting. "Stop!" she screamed, the desperation in her voice cutting through the silence of the forest. But the bear wasn't listening. It swiped again, and this time its claws raked down her leg, leaving deep gashes across her calf. Emily cried out, falling to her knees as the pain lanced through her body. She was bleeding, and the weight of it hit her all at once. The sight of blood, the fear of being too weak to fight, it all rushed through her. Please, please, she begged, trying to move, trying to get away. The bear hesitated, its nose twitching as it sniffed at the air around her. Then, for reasons she couldn't understand, it stopped. Emily could hardly breathe, her chest tight from fear, her legs shaking with exhaustion. The bear was standing just a few feet away, its massive head dipping low as if to sniff her once more. Her blood stained the ground, and the pain in her leg and shoulder made it almost impossible to think clearly. Then, with a final growl, the bear turned and began to retreat into the trees. It wasn't a charge, but it wasn't a departure either. It was as if the bear had lost interest for now, deciding it had done enough damage. Emily collapsed onto the ground, her body aching from the brutal swipe. She gasped for air, her heart still racing as the bear disappeared into the underbrush. She couldn't move for a long moment, too shocked and hurt to even attempt to stand. The world seemed to spin around her, the blood staining her clothes, the cold air pressing in. I'm alive, she whispered to herself, though the words barely made sense. But she knew that wouldn't last forever. The bear was still out there, and it had shown its power. She had no choice but to survive, to keep moving, or the night would bring more than she could handle. Taking a slow, labored breath, Emily pushed herself up, her hand pressing against her bleeding shoulder. She had to get to the ranger station. She had to survive. The forest had gone deathly silent. The only sounds were Emily's ragged breaths, her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she lay on the cold ground, trying to gather what little strength she had left. The pain in her shoulder and leg was almost unbearable, and she could feel the blood soaking through her clothes, the sticky warmth of it pressing against her skin. Her vision blurred at the edges, and she forced herself to blink, trying to focus. I can't stay here, she muttered to herself, her voice hoarse and weak. Her mind screamed for her to move, to get up and keep going, but her body refused to cooperate. She had just faced the bear, fought against its fury and barely escaped with her life, but she knew that if she didn't get to safety soon, it would all be for nothing. She pushed herself up on shaky arms, the ground spinning beneath her as she tried to regain her balance. Her knees wobbled, and the world seemed to tilt as the dizziness hit her like a wave. Every breath she took was sharp and shallow, each inhale a reminder of the physical toll the attack had taken. But she couldn't afford to pass out here, not in the middle of the forest, not so close to the bear. Taking another ragged breath, Emily gritted her teeth and forced herself onto her feet. The pain in her leg shot up like a jolt of electricity, but she fought through it. She couldn't stop. She couldn't just lie down and wait for the night to claim her, not after what she had just survived. Come on, Emily, she whispered through clenched teeth. You've got to move. The thought of being alone in the wilderness, injured and helpless, filled her with dread. Her eyes flicked around the clearing, scanning for any sign of movement, but the bear had retreated. She hadn't imagined it. It was gone, at least for now. She had to use this opportunity to get as far away as possible. She took a few unsteady steps, each one a struggle as her injured leg protested with each motion. She paused, clutching a nearby tree for support, feeling the bark press against her palm, grounding her in the present moment. Every time she looked at the trail ahead, it seemed to stretch on endlessly, as though the forest itself was conspiring against her. Her thoughts were scattered. She needed to get to the ranger station. She needed help. But the reality of the situation sank in. She had no idea how far away it was, and she couldn't call for help. Her phone had no signal, and she had no way of knowing if anyone would be able to find her in time. Stay focused, she muttered, shaking her head to clear the fog of panic that threatened to overtake her. Just keep moving. With a painful grunt, she pushed herself forward, her pace slow and deliberate as she limped down the trail. Each step sent spikes of pain through her body, but she forced herself to keep going. She tried to ignore the sharpness of her shoulder wound, the way it pulled with each movement, but it was impossible to forget. The pain was constant, a nagging reminder that time was running out. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the shadows of the forest seemed to grow longer, more menacing. Emily's breath came in short bursts, the weight of her exhaustion pulling at her. The adrenaline that had once kept her going was beginning to fade, leaving behind a deep sense of fatigue that made each step feel like a battle. She stumbled again, her foot catching on a hidden rock, and she nearly fell face first into the dirt. With a strangled gasp, she caught herself against a nearby tree, her chest heaving. Sweat soaked her hair, dripping down into her eyes, but she didn't have the energy to wipe it away. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself, trying to find the strength to continue. "Come on," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You can't stop now." But the weight of the forest, the night closing in around her, made it harder and harder to fight the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. Her injured leg felt like dead weight, and the blood from her shoulder wound had begun to feel cold against her skin. It was taking longer to reach the ranger station than she had anticipated, and she had no idea how much time she had before the darkness fully descended. "Where is everybody?" she muttered, as though someone would answer her from the shadows. Her body was screaming for her to stop, to rest, but she knew that if she did, the consequences could be dire. The bear could come back, and even if it didn't, the forest was unforgiving. The cold would set in soon, and the loss of blood, the injury. Emily wasn't sure how long she could keep going. She glanced up ahead, her vision blurry and unfocused, but she saw a flicker of light in the distance. It could have been a trick of her mind, a desperate hope playing tricks on her senses, but she took it as a sign. It had to be the ranger station. She had to get there no matter what. Summoning every ounce of willpower, she pushed herself forward again, her steps unsteady but resolute. The light in the distance grew brighter as she continued, the last of her strength burning away with each agonizing step. Her breathing became more labored, and the blood from her injuries stained the path beneath her, a grim reminder of how close she had come to death. Finally, after what felt like hours, she reached the clearing. She saw the glow of lanterns and heard the faint sound of voices, human voices. Her heart surged with a mix of relief and fear, the realization that help was finally within reach. "Help!" she called out, her voice raw and desperate. "Please, help me!" Her vision blurred as she stumbled into the clearing, and she collapsed onto the ground, her legs giving out beneath her. She could feel her body trembling uncontrollably, the pain in her shoulder and leg overwhelming her senses. Her eyes closed for a moment, the darkness creeping in at the edges of her vision. The next thing she knew, someone was kneeling beside her. A voice calling her name, hands gently but firmly checking her wounds. She barely registered the words as the world around her seemed to fade in and out, her consciousness slipping in and out of focus. "Stay with me, ma'am," a calm, steady voice said. "We're going to get you help." The last thing Emily saw before the world went black was the worried face of a park ranger, and then everything went dark. The crackling sound of the campfire filled the air, mixing with the chirping of crickets and the soft rustle of leaves in the gentle night breeze. Emily blinked against the blinding brightness of the fire, the warmth of the flames a stark contrast to the coldness that had settled into her bones. She was back at the ranger station, her wounds tended to as best as they could be, but her mind was still racing. The encounter with the grizzly bear felt like a nightmare, but the pain in her shoulder and leg was proof that it had been all too real. A park ranger, a tall man in his mid-30s, stood by the fire, his hands working quickly to stoke the flames and keep them burning bright. His face was stern, but there was concern in his eyes as he glanced over at Emily, who was sitting on a weathered wooden bench, her shoulder bandaged and her leg propped up on a pile of blankets. "You're lucky," he said softly, his voice low and calm. "Could have been worse if you hadn't gotten out of there when you did." Emily nodded, not trusting herself to speak just yet. She had been through so much over the past few hours, more than she had ever expected when she set out on her solo hike that morning. Now, sitting here in the warmth of the fire, the full weight of what had happened was starting to sink in. The ranger had arrived just in time, following her trail after hearing her desperate cries. The bear had been long gone, but Emily's body had taken the brunt of the attack. She'd been bleeding heavily from her shoulder and leg, but the ranger had helped stop the bleeding, applying pressure to her wounds and making sure she stayed awake long enough to get her to safety. How long was I out?" Emily asked, her voice hoarse from both the trauma and the exhaustion. "Not long," the ranger replied, his eyes scanning the dark forest around them. "I found you about half an hour after you called out. You were in pretty bad shape, but nothing life-threatening. We've got you stable now." Emily took a deep breath, trying to ease the tension in her chest. It was hard to believe that she was actually safe. that the bear was no longer out there stalking her through the trees, but the fear still clung to her tight in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. I thought I wasn't going to make it." The ranger gave her a small, reassuring smile, though his expression remained serious. "It's my job to make sure that doesn't happen," he said. "You're lucky I got to you when I did. If you'd passed out there, I wouldn't have been able to help you." Emily's eyes drifted over to the shadows beyond the firelight, the forest that had once felt so peaceful now appearing dark and threatening. She shivered involuntarily, her thoughts returning to the grizzly bear, to the moment when its massive claws had raked across her body. Her shoulder still throbbed with pain, but it was the terror of the attack that lingered in her mind, the growl of the bear, the weight of its presence. "Is it gone, the bear?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't want to know the answer, but she had to ask. "Will it come back?" The ranger paused for a moment, glancing toward the forest with a thoughtful expression. "It's gone for now," he said slowly. "But there's always a chance it could come back. Bears are territorial, especially this time of year when they're fattening up for hibernation. You're safe for now, but I wouldn't recommend heading back out there tonight." Emily nodded, grateful for his reassurances, but the fear still gnawed at her insides. The thought of that bear watching her, waiting for her to make a wrong move, still felt fresh in her mind. She shuddered at the memory of its eyes, dark and calculating, its growl like the rumble of thunder before a storm. I didn't think it would happen like that," Emily said, her voice barely audible. "I thought I knew the rules. I read the warnings. But I wasn't prepared for something like that. I didn't think I'd be so vulnerable." The ranger nodded, his expression softening as he crouched down in front of her. "It's easy to think we're prepared for everything when we read the pamphlets or we watch the documentaries, but nothing truly prepares you for the reality of it. You did what you needed to do to survive, and that's what matters." Emily bit her lip, staring into the fire. She wasn't sure if she believed him. Part of her felt like she had failed, like she should have done something differently, something more. She had heard the advice, "Don't run, make yourself look bigger, don't show fear." But in that moment, when the bear had charged, all she had felt was pure terror. And when she had sprayed the bear, it had only been by instinct, a reaction to the overwhelming presence of such a powerful creature. "Do you think I was too close to it? Do you think that's why it attacked me?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I don't know what went wrong." The ranger was silent for a long moment, considering her question. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and calm. "It's hard to say for sure. Bears are unpredictable. Sometimes they attack out of hunger, sometimes out of curiosity, or even because they feel threatened. It's possible you were too close, or maybe the bear was just testing its boundaries. Either way, it wasn't personal, it was just instinct." Emily exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. She had to remind herself that it wasn't her fault. She had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but that didn't mean she had been careless or foolish. The bear had acted as bears do, wild, unpredictable, and driven by instinct. I don't know what to do now," Emily said, the fear in her voice creeping back in. "I don't want to go back out there, I can't. But I can't stay here either, I need to keep going." The ranger looked at her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "The only thing you need to do right now is rest," he said gently. "The trail will still be there tomorrow and the next day. You can take a few days, or however long it takes, to recover. But for now, you need to focus on getting better. You've been through a lot." Emily swallowed hard, the enormity of it all sinking in. She had survived a grizzly bear attack. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie, but the pain in her shoulder was all too real. "I don't know if I can do it," she whispered, more to herself than to the ranger. "I don't know if I can keep going after everything that happened today." The ranger offered her a small smile, though his eyes held an understanding that made Emily feel less alone. "It's okay to be scared. It's okay to be shaken up. You've been through something traumatic, but you'll make it through. One step at a time." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, letting his words settle in. She had been through something unimaginable, something she hadn't prepared for. But for the first time since the attack, she felt the faintest stirrings of hope. Maybe she could keep going. Maybe after all she would make it out of the forest. The morning light filtered through the trees in soft golden beams, casting long shadows on the ground as Emily sat in the ranger station, staring at her feet. Her body still ached, and the fatigue from the previous day's events clung to her like a heavy blanket. The pain in her shoulder had dulled somewhat, but the bandages were soaked with dried blood, and she knew the wound would need proper care soon. Her leg was no better, still swollen and throbbing where the bear's claws had raked across it. The ranger had been gone for most of the morning, taking a group of hikers out for a routine checkup, and Emily had been left alone with her thoughts. The solitude felt suffocating, as though the walls of the station were closing in on her. She replayed the events from yesterday over and over in her mind. The growl of the bear, the feeling of its claws tearing into her flesh, the desperate fight for survival. She knew she had been lucky, many weren't, and she had seen enough of the stories on the news to understand that. But that didn't stop the fear from lingering, gnawing at her insides. She hadn't asked to be a survivor. It wasn't something she could feel proud of just yet. All she could do was sit there waiting, hoping that the worst was behind her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up sharply, startled by the sudden sound. The door creaked open, and the ranger stepped inside, his face creased with concern. He had a small bag slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Emily. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. "I brought some fresh supplies. We need to take a look at your wounds." Emily nodded, pushing herself up from the bench. Her body protested, but she fought through it. She wasn't used to sitting still, and the weight of it was starting to wear on her. "I'm okay," she said, her voice rough from a night of restless sleep. "It's just everything feels so overwhelming." The ranger smiled sympathetically, though his eyes still held a measure of seriousness. "I get it, but you need to take care of yourself first, okay? We'll have you patched up, and then we can talk about your next steps." Emily followed him to the small table where the ranger had set out a first aid kit and several clean cloths. He gently helped her sit down, positioning her injured leg with care. The sharp sting from her shoulder made her wince, but she bit her lip and stayed silent. She didn't want to show weakness. Not here, not now. He started with her shoulder, carefully unwrapping the bandages. Emily could feel his gaze on the wound, the way his fingers moved with practiced ease. He said nothing for a moment, and Emily focused on her breath, trying to stay as still as possible. "You've got a deep gash here," he finally said, his voice calm but serious. "But it's not as bad as it could have been. You're lucky it didn't hit any major blood vessels." Emily nodded, trying to concentrate on his words, but the pain from her leg, the weight of the previous day's events, all of it threatened to overwhelm her. She wanted to look out the window to see the sun, to forget for just a moment that she had nearly died at the hands of a wild animal, but there was no escaping the reality of it. "I was so scared," she admitted quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought it would go like that. I didn't think the bear would attack me like that." The ranger paused for a moment, glancing up at her with a look of understanding. "Bears don't usually attack unless they feel threatened or if they're hungry or, in your case, it could have been a territorial thing. You crossed into its space. It's a reaction, not personal." Emily shifted uncomfortably, feeling a mix of guilt and confusion. She had read the pamphlets, listened to the advice from other hikers. Stay calm, stay still, back away slowly. But in the face of that massive bear, none of it had worked. She had been terrified, frozen in place. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't think it would come after me. I didn't think it would attack." "No," the ranger said gently, his hands still working with the bandages. "You didn't do anything wrong. Bears are unpredictable. They act on instinct. There's no way you could have known. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, that's all." "But I didn't know what to do," Emily said, her eyes welling with tears. "I panicked. I couldn't move. I froze." "Everyone freezes in a moment like that," the ranger replied, his voice soft. "That's natural. You don't have to be a hero. You did what you could, and you're here now." His words, simple but sincere, settled in her chest like a balm. She nodded, trying to push the emotions back down, trying to hold it together. She wasn't used to crying, to showing vulnerability, but everything about this experience had shaken her to the core. After a moment, The ranger finished tending to her shoulder, wrapping it in a fresh, clean bandage. He moved onto her leg, carefully removing the makeshift bandages she had put on the night before. The wounds on her calf were deep, but not life-threatening, though the pain was still sharp and unrelenting. "Once we get you patched up, we'll take you back to the nearest town," he said, focusing on her leg. "You need to see a doctor. We can't take any chances with the infection risk." Emily nodded again, but she didn't speak. She was tired, so tired, and all she wanted was to rest. But the thought of the bear, of the brush with death, still hung over her like a dark cloud. She had survived, but the cost had been high. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, her gaze distant. "Do I just go back to my normal life, or do I keep hiking? Keep going?" The ranger paused, considering her question. "You need to heal first," he said, his voice firm. "Then you can decide, but you don't have to rush into anything. Sometimes it's better to take time to reflect, to come to terms with what happened before you move forward." Emily stared down at her leg, at the bandages that covered her wounds, and the realization hit her again like a punch to the gut. She had been lucky, so lucky. And for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of that luck. It wasn't just that she had survived. The bear could have easily killed her if it wanted to. It was that she was still here. She was alive. "Maybe I need to take some time," she whispered, more to herself than to the ranger. "Maybe I need to think." The ranger didn't answer right away, but when he did, his voice was gentle. "That's okay. You're in control now. Take all the time you need." The world outside the ranger station felt quiet, peaceful even. But Emily knew that the fear and the uncertainty weren't gone. Not yet. But at least for now she had a chance to breathe, to recover, to figure out what came next. "Thank you," she said softly, finally meeting the ranger's gaze. "For everything." "You're welcome," he replied with a nod, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Now let's get you the rest you need." The morning after the ranger had tended to her wounds, Emily found herself sitting on a wooden bench outside the small ranger station, the bright sunlight filtering through the trees. The forest around her seemed peaceful, serene and almost untouched by the violence of the day before. The air was cool and fresh, and the chirping of birds filled the quiet space. But inside, Emily felt anything but peaceful. Her body was healing. Yes, but the memories of the bear attack were still fresh, a haunting echo in her mind. She had not slept much the night before. The images of the bear's massive form, its growl reverberating in her chest, had kept her wide awake, her heart racing whenever the wind rustled the trees outside. It wasn't that she felt unsafe now. She knew she was protected by the ranger and the station, but the fear still lingered. How could she move past this? How could she continue her journey knowing that at any moment something could happen? Again? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. She turned to see the ranger coming toward her, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, his face serious but kind. "How are you feeling today?" he asked as he stopped in front of her. Emily gave him a tired smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Better, I guess," she said, her voice still rough. "The pain's not as bad today, but I'm not sure if I'm ready to head back out yet." The ranger nodded, understanding in his expression. "That's okay, it's not something you should rush. You've been through a lot, and it's not just your body that needs to heal. Your mind, too. The bear encounter wasn't something anyone is prepared for, especially in the way it happened." Emily sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. "I keep replaying it in my head. The growl, the way it came out of nowhere, I froze, and I feel like I could have done more to get away. Maybe I could have avoided it altogether if I hadn't been so careless." The ranger sat down beside her, his posture relaxed, but his voice firm. "You weren't careless, Emily. You did what anyone would do in that situation. It's instinct to freeze when faced with something that big and dangerous. It's not about doing something wrong, it's about surviving." Emily looked at him, her eyes searching for reassurance. She wanted to believe him, wanted to take comfort in his words, but there was still a part of her that couldn't shake, the doubt. "But I was so scared," she whispered. "I couldn't even think straight. I've hiked so many trails and I've always felt prepared. But yesterday, it was like everything I knew just didn't matter anymore." The ranger placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but kind. It's normal to feel that way after something traumatic. It's not about what you could have done differently. It's about the fact that you survived. Not everyone gets that chance, you know. Emily nodded, though the weight of his words made her heart ache. She had been so close to losing everything in a matter of seconds. She had been lucky, she knew that, but luck didn't change the fact that the attack had shaken her to her core. Maybe I should just go home, she said quietly, more to herself than to the ranger. Maybe I'm not cut out for this anymore. Maybe I'm not cut out for hiking alone. The ranger gave her a thoughtful look, his eyes not judgmental but filled with understanding. That's your choice, Emily. You don't have to keep hiking. No one's forcing you to do anything, but don't let one bad experience dictate what you can or can't do. Take time, think it through, and then decide what feels right for you. Emily stared at the ground, her fingers nervously, twisting the fabric of her jacket. He was right. No one was forcing her to keep hiking, but there was still something inside her that didn't want to give up, didn't want to let fear dictate her choices. She had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to handle any situation. But this was different. The fear felt all-encompassing, and the thought of returning to the trails felt like an impossible task. What if I'm too scared, she asked, her voice barely audible. What if I can't do it? What if I go out there again and something happens? And I freeze again? The ranger's tone was steady, calm. Then you freeze. And that's... okay, it's a natural reaction. The point is you can try again, and if you freeze, you get back up and try again. But you don't have to make any decisions today. You have time. Emily let out a breath, unsure of what to do with the overwhelming mixture of emotions swirling inside her. Part of her wanted to push forward, to prove that she wasn't defined by fear. But another part of her wondered if this would always haunt her, if the image of that bear would be too much to bear. I don't know if I can do it, she said, shaking her head. You don't have to figure it all out in one day, the ranger said, standing up. What matters right now is that you're safe. You're here. Tomorrow's another day. Emily sat in silence as the ranger walked back toward the station, his footsteps fading into the distance. Her gaze turned back to the forest, the place. That had once brought her so much peace, now fraught with so much fear. She couldn't help but wonder if she was running away from something, if this fear was something she needed to face head-on. Her hand went to her shoulder, where the bandages were still fresh, and she winced slightly. The pain was there, but it wasn't unbearable. What really weighed on her was the uncertainty in her heart. She had come here to escape the noise of the world, to find some peace in the wilderness, but instead the wilderness had found her, testing her in ways she hadn't imagined. A part of her wanted to run, to leave it all behind and go back to the safety of her normal life. But there was another part of her that couldn't ignore the pull of the trail, the feeling of being lost in the wild, away from everything. She stood up slowly, her body still aching but stronger than it had been yesterday. She took a deep breath and looked out toward the mountains, the trails she had once loved stretching into the distance. Maybe it wasn't about being fearless. Maybe it was about being able to face the fear and push through it. I'll think about it, she whispered to herself, her voice barely above a breath. I'll think about it and see what feels right. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead was unclear, but for the first time in a long while, Emily felt like maybe, just maybe, she could face it, one step at a time. The sun had barely begun to rise when Emily made her way back into the ranger station, the early morning light casting a pale glow over the landscape. The night had been restless. Her dreams were filled with the echoes of growls, the sharp scrape of claws against her skin, and the oppressive weight of fear that she couldn't shake even in her sleep. She wasn't sure what had kept her awake more, her injuries or the gnawing sense of unease that still clung to her, a feeling that hadn't quite faded since her encounter with the bear. She had been trying to convince herself that she was safe now, that the worst was over. But there was still a part of her that felt like she was on the edge, teetering between survival and the unknown. When she entered the station, she found the ranger seated at the small desk, flipping through some papers. He glanced up as she walked in, and his face softened with recognition. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but still professional. "How are you feeling today?" Emily shrugged, unsure of how to answer. "I'm okay," she replied, though the words didn't feel entirely true. Her shoulder still ached, and the swelling in her leg hadn't gone down as much as she'd hoped. But more than the physical pain, it was the mental toll that weighed on her. "I was thinking about yesterday," she began, the words coming out slower than she intended. "About the bear and how everything just happened so fast. I thought I was prepared, you know. I've done hikes like this before. I've read the warnings, I've learned the safety tips. But in the moment, none of it mattered. I froze. I couldn't even think straight." The ranger put down the papers and looked at her with understanding. "It's normal to freeze, especially when you're faced with something like that. Your body reacts faster than your mind. And when something so unpredictable happens, it's hard to process. But it's important to remember, you're here, you survived." Emily nodded, but the doubt still gnawed at her. "I don't know if I can go back out there," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I freeze again? What if I don't make it?" "You don't have to decide right now," the ranger said, his tone firm but comforting. "Take all the time you need. The forest isn't going anywhere. You've been through something traumatic, and it's okay to take a step back, to think things through before you push forward. But don't let fear make the decision for you." Emily sat down across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The ranger's words hit her harder than she expected. She wasn't used to being afraid. Hiking had always been her way to escape, to find solace in the quiet, to feel capable. But now it felt like the forest had turned against her, had taken something from her that she wasn't sure she could get back. "I've always been independent," Emily said, her voice laced with frustration. "I've always been the kind of person who takes care of herself. But yesterday I couldn't do anything. I was helpless. I was scared out of my mind." "You're not alone in that," the ranger replied, his gaze steady. "It's easy to think that you should always have control in situations like this. But fear is real. It's part of being human. And sometimes it takes a moment of fear to realize just how strong you are. You're here. You got out of that situation. That's strength." Emily took a deep breath, letting the words sink in. "I don't know if I can go back out there," she repeated, the uncertainty hanging in the air. "But I don't want to just give up either. I don't want to let fear win." The ranger smiled slightly, standing up and walking over to the small cabinet where he kept the maps. "Fear doesn't have to win, but you also don't have to fight it all at once. You can go at your own pace. Start small, take a short hike just a little further down the trail. No pressure, no expectations. See how you feel." Emily stared at the map he spread out on the table, the trails winding through the vast wilderness, each line representing an adventure, a challenge, a test. She thought about how much the forest had meant to her before, how it had been a place to find peace, to escape, to simply exist without the noise of the world. But now, it felt like a battleground, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to return to it. "Maybe," she said slowly, the words tentative. "Maybe I could try a short hike, just something easy, nothing too far. But I don't want to feel like I'm running away from this." The ranger nodded, his expression kind. "You won't be running away. It's not about avoiding fear, it's about facing it when you're ready. And if today isn't the day, that's okay too, no one's rushing you." Emily stood up, her body protesting, but she ignored the ache in her leg. The pain was still there, but it wasn't the physical pain that had her so wound tight. It was the fear, the lingering terror. That had gripped her when she'd been alone with the bear. That was the part she hadn't been able to shake, and it was the part she knew she needed to face. "I'll think about it," she said, more to herself than to him. "Maybe a short hike is a good idea." The ranger smiled, though there was a hint of relief in his eyes. "That's all I'm asking. Take it one step at a time, no pressure." Emily nodded, grateful for the ranger's patience. He had been more than just a rescuer. He had been someone who understood, who didn't push her to move faster than she was capable of. She looked back at the map again, her finger tracing the familiar trails. She wasn't sure if she was ready to go back out there yet, but the idea of trying, of taking a step forward, felt like something she needed to do. She wasn't ready to let fear control her life. "Thank you," Emily said, her voice quieter now. "For everything. For being patient with me." The ranger gave her a nod, his expression warm. "It's what I'm here for. Take care of yourself, and when you're ready, we'll take it one step at a time." Emily didn't have all the answers, and she didn't know what her next steps would be. But for the first time in days, she felt a small spark of hope. She wasn't sure if she could fully recover, but maybe, just maybe, she could start to heal. And that, she thought, was enough for today. The day had come at last. Emily stood at the edge of the forest, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of her decision settling heavily on her shoulders. It had been days since the bear attack, and though she had spent much of that time recovering, both physically and emotionally, today felt like a turning point. The fear still lingered, but there was something else too, a quiet determination, a desire to face the unknown, to not let the terror she had experienced define her. She turned to the ranger, who stood beside her, his gaze gentle but knowing. They had spent the morning talking, making plans for a short, easy hike, a test to see how she would handle being back in the forest. It wasn't about conquering her fear all at once. It was about taking a small step, moving forward at her own pace. "You ready?" he asked, his voice steady, giving her space but offering support. Emily nodded, though her throat was tight. "Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure what to expect, but I have to try." The ranger smiled slightly, a look of understanding in his eyes. "No rush. We'll stick to the trail near the station. It's a good starting point. We're not going far, just enough to see how you feel." Emily took a deep breath, the cool morning air filling her lungs. She looked out over the trail ahead. The familiar winding path that had once felt so inviting now seemed like an obstacle. The trees were dense, casting long shadows across the earth. She could almost hear the sound of the bear's growl, feel the weight of its presence in the air, but she pushed the thoughts aside. She had been through the worst, and now it was time to see if she could move beyond it. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she took her first step, and she immediately felt the ache in her leg, still swollen and tender, but she ignored it. One step, then another. The familiar rhythm of walking slowly began to ease some of the tension in her body, but every rustle of leaves, every distant creak of a branch, sent a flicker of fear through her. She had never realized how alive the forest could be, how many sounds and movements existed just beyond her vision. "Take your time," the ranger said, walking beside her. "No need to rush." Emily glanced over at him, his presence reassuring, but not smothering. He walked just a little ahead of her, allowing her to move at her own pace. He had been patient with her from the start, giving her the space to make decisions, to take the time she needed. This wasn't about forcing her into anything. It was about regaining her sense of control bit by bit. "So," the ranger continued, trying to keep the conversation light, "how's your shoulder? Any better?" Emily shifted her backpack, the weight of it still a reminder of how vulnerable she had felt in the days following the attack. The pain in her shoulder had dulled, but it still ached from time to time. She pulled her jacket sleeve back, examining the fresh bandages that were starting to feel a little too tight. "It's sore, but it's getting better," she said, giving him a half smile. "I think I'm going to be okay." The ranger nodded. "Good. But remember, it's okay to take breaks when you need them. You're doing great." They continued. Down the trail, the trees growing thicker around them, the forest pressing in from all sides. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the ground, and Emily felt a slight sense of peace wash over her. The trail was easy enough to navigate, the path clear and familiar. But with every step, the memories of the bear came rushing back, the sound of its growl, the flash of its claws. It was still fresh in her mind, like a wound that hadn't fully healed. After a while, Emily paused, resting her hands on her knees to catch her breath. She looked around, taking in the quiet of the forest. There was a certain stillness here, a kind of beauty that felt almost sacred. For a moment, it was easy to forget about the fear, the trauma, the attack. This place, the forest, had always been her refuge, and in some strange way it still was. "You okay?" the ranger asked, his voice gentle. Emily straightened up, nodding. "Yeah, just needed a second." The ranger smiled. "Take all the seconds you need. No rush." Emily felt a wave of gratitude for his calm demeanor, for the way he gave her the space to process her thoughts and feelings. There were no expectations here, no judgments. It was just her and the trail. She pushed off from the tree she had been leaning against and continued walking, slowly this time, taking in the sounds of the forest around her, the chirping of birds, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of a deer. It was a reminder of how alive everything was, how full of life the world still was, despite the darkness that had nearly consumed her. As she walked, she noticed the subtle changes in her body. Her breath was steadier, her legs moving with less resistance, and even the pain in her shoulder seemed to lessen with each step. The fear was still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been before. She was still afraid, but she was doing it. She was walking, moving forward one step at a time. They reached a small clearing in the trail, and the ranger stopped, turning to face her. "How are you feeling?" Emily looked up at him, surprised by the question. For the first time in what felt like days, she took a moment to really listen to her body, to check in with how she was doing. She wasn't sure, but something inside her felt different. Lighter, maybe, like the weight of the bear, of the fear, was finally starting to lift. "I think I'm okay," she said slowly, a hesitant smile tugging at her lips. "I'm not completely over it, but I'm taking steps." The ranger nodded, his expression softening. "That's all any of us can do. One step at a time." Emily looked out into the clearing, her gaze following the trail that stretched out ahead. She knew she wasn't done with her fear, that it would linger in the back of her mind for some time. But for the first time she felt like she could handle it. She could face it, at least for today. "I'll keep going," she said, more to herself than to the ranger, but he heard it. "I'll keep going." The ranger gave her a knowing look and turned back toward the trail. "Let's keep moving then." They continued down the path, the sounds of the forest wrapping around them like a protective cloak. Emily wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring or the day after, but for now she was walking forward. She was healing, and maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back to the peace the forest had once offered, one step at a time.